To understand why artillery first emerged in Western civilizations, we need to return to ancient Greece, the place that laid the earliest foundations for this kind of military technology. Around the 5th century BC, city-states like Miletus, Tarentum, and especially Syracuse began experimenting with upgrading traditional weapons, specifically the bow. At this point, Greek engineers and craftsmen realized that ordinary bows no longer had enough power to pierce the increasingly formidable defenses of their enemies. This drove them to create massive composite bows, which were assembled from multiple parts to boost their shooting force. These first weapons were often given the rather colorful nickname belly shooters because the user had to brace the weapon against their stomach to draw the string, using their own body weight to increase the power. However, these giant bows were still limited in practical use, since drawing the string was a strenuous and exhausting task. The breakthrough came when Greek inventors developed the winch system. This innovation allowed warriors and siege soldiers to pull back the bowstring using a mechanical device, reducing the strain on the human body and opening up the possibility of creating much more powerful weapons. One standout figure in this process was Dionysius, the notorious tyrant of Syracuse. Driven by a desire to transform Syracuse into an impregnable fortress against the constant threat from Carthage, Dionysius not only actively recruited talented engineers from all across the Greek world, but also poured significant resources into researching and developing siege weaponry. Under his patronage, engineers continually refined their machines, raising siege technology to an entirely new level. At that time, Syracuse was often likened to the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, a place where the brightest minds and most advanced military technology in the Mediterranean converged. The next major turning point in ancient artillery technology came when Greek engineers realized they could store far more energy by using twisted bundles of rope in place of traditional composite bow arms. This mechanism, known as the torsion spring, made it possible to accumulate and release much greater force, while also reducing the overall size of stone throwers and arrow launchers, making them easier to transport and deploy on the battlefield. The arrival of the torsion spring in the 4th century BC completely changed how Greek military leaders approached siege warfare. During this period, the ongoing conflicts between Greek kingdoms, especially under the reign of Alexander the Great, created ideal conditions for artillery inventions to be continually tested and refined. In every siege campaign, from the city of Thebes to the imposing walls of Asia Minor, artillery played an increasingly vital role. Alexander's armies brought with them powerful stone throwers and giant arrow launchers, using them not only to breach fortifications, but also to undermine the morale and fighting spirit of the defenders. Innovation did not stop at engineering alone. Greek military engineers also focused on rewriting the rules of operation, optimizing designs down to the size of the torsion cords, the materials used for the frames, and precise calculations for firing force to match different types of projectiles. Manuals for building and operating artillery were carefully recorded and passed down to later generations, transforming this technology into a true branch of science and engineering rather than just an art of combat based on experience. Thanks to these ongoing advances, artillery not only helped reshape the way ancient armies conducted sieges, but also ignited a technological arms race between the major civilizations of the Mediterranean. In the early stages of its history, Rome was merely a small city-state located in southern Italy, far removed from the advanced weaponry of the great Mediterranean civilizations. In reality, the early Romans mainly used traditional weapons and tactics with no experience of the sophisticated artillery systems the Greeks had already developed. At that time, Greek city-states like Tarentum and Syracuse not only led the way in science and engineering, but also acted as suppliers of cutting-edge military technology for the entire region. A major turning point came when Rome confronted and eventually defeated King Pyrrhus of Epirus during the Pyrrhic War in the early 3rd century BC. After this victory, the Romans not only expanded their territory but also gained direct access to the Greek city-states in southern Italy. Here, Rome did not merely conquer, but also absorbed a great number of Greek engineers, craftsmen, and a treasure trove of military technology, including stone throwers, arrow launchers, and knowledge of artillery construction. This marked the beginning of Rome's process of adopting and gradually improving upon Greek artillery technology. However, for many decades afterward, artillery still played a relatively modest role in the Roman army. In these early times, the Romans often had to rely on their Greek allies or hire Greek engineers to build and operate stone throwers and arrow launchers whenever they were needed in siege warfare. The true turning point for Roman artillery came during the major conflicts between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars, which spanned from the 3rd to the 2nd century BC. At first, Rome still wasn't truly proactive in deploying artillery. They mainly used these weapons on a small scale, either acquired from Greek allies or captured from conquered city-states. However, as the war continued to expand, especially after Rome gained control over Carthage's major cities in Spain and Sicily, the Romans seized vast military depots containing hundreds of stone throwers, arrow launchers, and other types of siege engines. Along with the weapons, Rome also gained access to skilled engineers and craftsmen from Carthage and other newly annexed territories. These specialists quickly passed on their knowledge of how to build and operate large-scale artillery to the Roman army. From that point onward, Rome was no longer an outsider when it came to military technology. The Roman army began actively integrating artillery into both siege and defensive operations, not just relying on captured weapons, but also producing and innovating based on what they had learned from the Greeks and Carthaginians. As the empire expanded, each major campaign gave the Romans new experience, new weapons, and technical improvements. By the 1st century BC, during the Roman Republic, the military had reached a remarkable level of professionalization. Artillery was no longer a patchwork tool, it had become standard equipment for every Roman force. Thanks to this process of standardization, various types of light and heavy stone throwers and arrow launchers were deployed in appropriate numbers at every level of the army, from the century to the cohort and up to the legion. This was especially evident during the campaigns of Julius Caesar. In his conquest of Gaul, Caesar frequently used artillery to build defensive lines, protect camps, support assaults, and even position them on strategic hills to suppress the enemy from a distance. This marked the period when Roman artillery was no longer limited to siege warfare, but became a flexible weapon serving multiple purposes on the open battlefield. By adopting technology from other civilizations and continually improving it, Rome transformed artillery into an indispensable part of its war machine, helping to build one of the greatest empires in human history. When it comes to the true power of the Roman army on the battlefield, we cannot overlook the artillery weapons that made their name, especially in siege warfare and the defense of camps. These machines not only reflected technological advancement, but also demonstrated the Romans' flexible tactical thinking, as they knew how to select the right tool for each specific situation. One of the most iconic types of Roman artillery was the onager. The name itself means wild donkey because every time it fired, the machine would recoil violently, much like an enraged animal. The onager operated on a fairly simple but effective principle. It used a torsion spring mechanism made from large twisted ropes that stored energy. When the operator turned the winch and released the large throwing arm, the stored torsion force was suddenly unleashed, propelling a stone or projectile forward at tremendous speed. However, compared to bolt throwers or the ballistae, the onager generally lacked accuracy. This made it best suited for attacking stationary targets such as city walls, gates, or heavily fortified structures. In many cases, the power of the onager was not just in its force, but also in its ability to sow psychological terror among the enemy. Each shot created a thunderous noise, shook the ground, and shattered obstacles in its path. Alongside the onager, the Roman army employed a wide range of double-armed torsion artillery. The ballista was the most prominent example. If the onager could be seen as an ancient cannon, then the ballista was the Roman equivalent of a giant crossbow. This weapon used two vertically mounted bundles of twisted rope, each attached to an arm like the limbs of a bow. When the bowstring was drawn back and released, energy from both torsion springs was unleashed simultaneously, launching bolts or stone projectiles with impressive precision. The greatest strength of the ballista lay in its accuracy, which made it highly effective for targeting critical defensive positions, picking off archers on city walls, or breaking up tightly clustered enemy formations. Especially in large siege battles, the Romans often deployed many ballistae at once, creating a rain of stones and arrows that would pour down upon the enemy. A smaller, more portable variant of the ballista was the scorpion. This was a compact and easy-to-handle catapult often issued to smaller units such as a century, about 80 soldiers. Each such unit typically had one scorpion to support defense or attack in hard-to-reach positions. The flexibility of the scorpion allowed Roman forces to deploy artillery even in the most difficult parts of the battlefield. The Romans didn't stop there. They continually improved their artillery. They focused on increasing the durability of the torsion springs, used better materials to minimize the effects of moisture and weather, and improved firing rates with faster loading mechanisms. Some designs even allowed for semi-automatic loading and continuous fire, greatly enhancing their suppressive capability and providing a distinct advantage in prolonged engagements. The scale and power of Roman artillery were further evident in how they organized and distributed these weapons within the army. At the cohort level, about 500 soldiers, each unit was typically equipped with a medium-sized ballista, providing infantry with tactical fire support when needed. At the legion level, the Romans could deploy massive artillery pieces specifically designed for large-scale sieges, machines capable of breaching thick walls or opening gaps for troops to storm through. The range of these weapons was remarkable for the ancient world. Depending on type and intended use, a ballista could shoot from 100 meters up to nearly a kilometer. The Romans also didn't limit themselves to rocks and large arrows. They devised a variety of projectiles, such as iron armor-piercing bolts and clay jars filled with burning oil to cause fires or chaos within enemy ranks. This diversity demonstrated that the Romans were not only technically skilled, but also highly inventive in the practical use of their weapons. In general, artillery was not merely an auxiliary tool, but a symbol of technological prowess and organizational intelligence in the Roman military. Thanks to their seamless combination of engineering, tactics, and creativity, the Romans made artillery an integral part of their journey to build and defend their mighty empire. Even though artillery was a revolutionary invention in ancient warfare, it did not always play a central role in every battle as portrayed in films. In reality, the Romans, like other civilizations, used artillery in ways that made tactical sense, taking into account battlefield conditions and the practicalities of transporting these weapons to the front lines. Primarily used in siege warfare. Throughout most of ancient military history, artillery proved to be most effective during sieges. When faced with formidable fortifications, the Romans would often deploy stone throwers and giant ballistae to break through walls, smash open massive gates, or clear defenders from critical strongpoints. The goal was not simply to destroy physical barriers, but also to undermine the defenders' morale, making it easier for infantry or assault teams to approach and use other tools to force an entry. Ancient sources, especially those of the Jewish historian Josephus, describe in vivid detail the terrifying level of carnage artillery inflicted during sieges, particularly during the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 1st century AD. Josephus wrote that the large stones and iron bolts fired by ballistae pierced multiple layers of shields and armor, sometimes even tearing heads or limbs clean off, leaving the battlefield a scene of utter horror and trauma for both sides. Beyond physical destruction, the whistling of flying stones, the thunderous crash of impacts, and the sight of collapsing walls all became powerful psychological weapons. Defenders were forced to live in a constant state of tension, their fighting spirit gradually worn down over time. Applications in pitched battles and naval warfare. Although artillery was invaluable in sieges, its role on open battlefields was much more limited due to its bulk and lack of mobility. Dragging these heavy machines across rough terrain and sometimes even having to cross rivers was a major challenge for any army. As a result, in most large-scale face-to-face engagements between armies, artillery usually played only a supporting role rather than being the decisive factor in victory. That said, there were still a few notable exceptions. Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most brilliant commanders, demonstrated real creativity in his use of artillery. During his campaigns in Gaul, he would position ballistae on high ground, such as hills, to bombard and pressure enemy forces advancing from below. In some battles, Caesar even placed artillery along the flanks of his formations, firing into the enemy cavalry or infantry as they tried to attack the weak points of the Roman line. These tactics not only slowed the enemy's advance, but also created a major advantage for the Roman infantry when it came time to counterattack. Outside of land battles, portable artillery such as the Scorpion was also mounted on Roman warships. These weapons enabled Roman sailors to fire at long range against enemy vessels in naval battles or to provide supporting fire for landing troops by bombarding the shoreline ahead of an amphibious assault. This flexibility made artillery a true force multiplier for the empire's many diverse campaigns, from desert to open sea. Effectiveness in battle. While the technological and engineering achievements of ancient artillery are undeniable, history shows that these weapons were by no means ultimate in every engagement. There is no record of two large armies simply bombarding each other with artillery until one side collapsed, as we often see in modern Hollywood films. Instead, artillery's primary role was as a support weapon, making it safer for infantry and siege troops to approach their objectives or disrupting enemy formations before the real fighting began. The limitations in range, rate of fire, preparation time, and accuracy meant that generals always had to weigh carefully whether to use artillery in open battle. Most victories still depended on the fighting skill, iron discipline, and organizational ability of the infantry. Artillery only truly fulfilled its potential when integrated seamlessly with other elements of the army's overall tactical plan. Over the centuries, the development of artillery enabled Rome and other civilizations to expand the scope of warfare, from towering city walls to vast stretches of open sea. Yet, it was not until the arrival of gunpowder weapons that artillery would finally take center stage on every battlefield. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the political map of Europe changed dramatically. The newly established kingdoms were smaller, had more limited resources, and their armies could no longer maintain the massive scale of Rome at its height. This made the deployment of large-scale artillery on open battlefields virtually impossible. From the late ancient period into the early Middle Ages, artillery was seen almost exclusively in sieges, where the lengthy preparations and ample space made it feasible to set up and operate such heavy machinery. A major turning point came around the 12th to 13th centuries when European engineers invented the counterweight trebuchet. Unlike ancient artillery, the trebuchet used a massive counterweight to launch stones weighing hundreds of pounds or even dead animals or barrels of boiling oil at fortified walls. The accuracy and destructive power of the trebuchet was so great that many fortresses once thought impregnable surrendered after only a few days of continuous bombardment. This was the era when artillery played its most prominent role in siege warfare, and it also marked the beginning of the end for the classic defensive strategy of relying solely on tall, thick stone walls in European castles. However, it's important to remember that, powerful as the trebuchet was, it was still not used frequently in pitched battles on open ground where two armies faced each other directly. Setting up and moving a massive trebuchet out in the open fields was almost unthinkable with the technology of the time. In most major engagements outside the walls, the outcome still depended on the strength of infantry, cavalry, and the use of flexible battlefield tactics. If we look at Hollywood blockbusters, we can see that the role of artillery is often exaggerated to make battles more dramatic and spectacular. In real history, the sight of dozens of catapults and ballistae launching hundreds of flaming projectiles across the sky only happened in a few exceptionally large sieges, or else exists purely in the modern imagination. In particular, the fireballs, rockets, and explosive effects commonly depicted in movies were entirely out of place in ancient or medieval settings. At the time, the weapons used were mainly stones, large arrows, or clay jars filled with flammable materials, fired to cause limited-scale damage. In short, artillery played a crucial role in siege warfare throughout ancient and medieval times, but it was rarely the main star on open battlefields. This reminds us that while cinema can heighten the drama, real history is often more modest and far more nuanced than what appears on the big screen. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of artillery. History always holds unexpected details, and only by taking an objective view can we truly understand the complexity and real limitations of warfare in the past. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. You can also share your thoughts or tell more interesting stories you know about ancient weapons and old wars. I look forward to hearing from you, and I'll continue bringing you even more fascinating content in upcoming videos.